They woke up before the sun answered to their lord's whims, and ended their day exhausted, nameless in the grand history books. But without them, castles would rot, fields would starve, and kingdoms would fall. What was life really like for the medieval servant? Not the knight, not the king, but the invisible backbone of the Middle Ages. You think you could handle it. You might not even last a week. They appear rarely in paintings, never in heroic ballads, and only occasionally in the margins of court records. Yet, in medieval Europe, the servant class made up the majority of the population, an invisible foundation holding up the castles, fields, and noble households. Unlike knights, monarchs, or clergy, these people left behind no family crests, no grand tombs, no letters or memoirs. What little we know comes from land rolls, tax records, and church registers. They were known not for who they were, but for what they did. Cooks, scullions, ploughmen, laundresses, stable boys, kitchen maids. The structure of medieval society was rigid and hierarchical. At the top stood the monarch, beneath him the nobles, knights, and clergy, but at the bottom, often below the threshold of written history, lived the peasants, the villeins, and the domestic servants. These were not always slaves in the legal sense, but their choices were often no freer. Bound to land or lord by custom, contract, or survival, they worked in manor houses, on farms, in workshops, or within castles. Their roles were essential and unacknowledged. Most servants were born into their station. In many parts of Europe, especially England and France, the feudal system locked generations into hereditary labor. A child born to a field hand would almost certainly die a field hand. Lords could demand forced labor from their tenants, and domestic service was one of the few available occupations that offered a stable if grueling existence. It wasn't uncommon for young boys and girls to be sent away by their families to serve in the homes of wealthier landowners by the time they reached adolescence. Despite their numbers, the historical record treats them as background figures. Their names were rarely recorded unless they committed a crime or were involved in legal disputes. Even then, they were referred to in functional terms. John the cook, Alice the washerwoman, the church, which preserved most medieval documents, focused on the spiritual elite. Chroniclers, often working under noble patronage, had little interest in documenting the lives of those sweeping the floors or carrying water. Popular imagery of the Middle Ages tends to focus on castles, courtly romance, and chivalric battles. But none of that was possible without the daily labor of servants. Knights needed their armor cleaned and their horses fed. Nobles required endless supplies of bread, mead, and linens. Castles depended on a small army of invisible laborers to maintain even the appearance of order. And while nobles squabbled over titles and land, servants were tasked with the physical upkeep of life itself, mending clothes, chopping wood, sowing seeds, scrubbing chamber pots. Their contributions weren't glamorous, but they were constant. And without them, the grandeur of the medieval world would have collapsed into mud and hunger. This is the world history rarely shows, not because it lacked significance, but because those who lived it were never meant to be remembered. By the 13th century, the structure of medieval Europe had hardened into a system that left little to chance and even less to ambition. Birth dictated nearly everything: what land you could work, whose orders you followed, how far your voice carried, and whether it mattered at all. For the majority who served in households, manors, or fields, their position wasn't chosen. It was inherited. In feudal society, not all servants were the same, though most were equally voiceless. At the bottom were the serfs. Unlike slaves, Serfs were not owned, but they were not free. They were legally tied to the land and could not leave the manor without the lord's permission. If the land was sold, the serfs were included in the transaction. Their work was mandatory, often unpaid beyond the right to live on a strip of land and farm it for subsistence. In exchange, they owed labor, sometimes several days a week on the lord's domain fields, as well as additional duties in the household, stables, or mills. Slightly above them were villeins, a term used mainly in England and parts of France. Villeins held more land than serfs and sometimes paid rent instead of labor, but they were still unfree in the eyes of the law. They couldn't marry without their lord's approval and were subject to various manorial obligations. The Domesday Book of 1086, one of the most comprehensive surveys of land and labor in medieval Europe, lists thousands of villeins, but only as economic units. Their individuality, like their freedom, was secondary to their function. Free laborers, though technically unbound, lived with a different kind of restraint. These were peasants who earned wages, often working alongside serfs and villeins in the same fields or kitchens. Their freedom was more legal than practical. Most could not afford to move, buy land, or decline work. They were still subject to manorial courts, church tithes, and seasonal famine. Few rose beyond their station. The boundaries between these groups were not always rigid, but they were heavily guarded, not by fences but by tradition, custom, and law. The Statute of Labourers, passed in England in 1351 after the Black Death, attempted to freeze wages and bind labourers to their home villages, fearing that rising demand would give workers too much leverage. Even catastrophe couldn't loosen the grip of hierarchy for long. From Germany's Grundeschaft to France's Bannerlights, local customs often dictated even more than royal edicts. Servants could be punished for leaving without permission, charged for simple life decisions, or fined for failing to show deference. The Church reinforced these roles, preaching obedience and humility as divine virtues, especially for the lower orders. There were exceptions. A few servants rose to trusted positions as stewards, bailiffs, or clerks, but these were rare. For most, the rules were unwritten but absolute. Work, obey, endure, and pass the same fate on to your children, long before sunrise. The manor stirs to life, not with fanfare, but with footsteps on stone and the clatter of wooden buckets. For the average servant in medieval Europe, the day begins in the dark. Long before the nobility rise from their feather-stuffed beds, sleep is a luxury, rest a brief interruption. In the kitchens, the scullery maids are first to move. Often the youngest and lowest ranked, they light the hearths and begin scrubbing pots from the night before. Water must be drawn by hand from the well, carried in heavy loads, and heated over open flames. The kitchen must be ready before the cooks arrive, because when they do, the pressure begins. Bread must be kneaded and baked in large ovens, often using coarse rye or barley. Porridge and stews must simmer in time for the household's first meal, typically consumed mid-morning. The pace is relentless. Mistakes, a burnt loaf, a spoilt chicken, can mean punishment or dismissal. Outside, stable hands tend to the horses. Their job is dirty and dangerous. Muck out the stalls, brush down the coats, ensure the animals are fed. In noble households, horses are prized assets for transport, for show, and in wartime. A neglected animal reflects poorly on the entire estate. Saddle fittings, shoe inspections, and cart preparations must all be completed before the lord or his steward makes an appearance. And when they do, stable hands step aside, invisible again until the next command. Field laborers, many of them villains or serfs, begin their work at first light. During the growing season, tasks are dictated by the agricultural calendar. Spring means ploughing with teams of oxen. Summer brings back breaking harvests under the sun. Autumn is for threshing and milling, while winter involves repairing tools, draining ditches, and maintaining fences. These tasks are assigned by the reeve, often a fellow peasant appointed by the lord. The work is communal and relentless, governed by the rotation of crops and the fear of a poor yield. A bad season can mean starvation, and there's no safety net. Even during feast days or holy observances, some work continues within the manor. Domestic servants, often young women, scrub floors, polish metalware, launder linens, and clean chamber pots. The higher the rank of the household, the more staff needed to maintain appearances. In wealthier estates, stewards and housekeepers manage the lower staff, but in smaller manors. Hierarchy is enforced informally through scolding, favoritism, or the threat of being replaced. Meals for servants are simple and eaten separately, often in shifts, after the household has been fed. Leftovers are common, but hunger isn't rare. The best cuts go to the Lord's table. Servants eat pottage, stale bread, and occasionally cheese or ale. For most, meat is rare. Malnutrition, dental decay, and joint pain from constant labor are part of life. By dusk, after the fires are doused and tools stored, curfew begins. In many towns and manors, bells or horns signaled the time to extinguish lights. Candles were expensive, and unauthorized movement after dark was forbidden. Those without permission to be outside risked fines or worse. Servants slept in cramped quarters, some on straw pallets in the kitchens or stables, others in attic rooms or shared lofts. Privacy didn't exist, neither did comfort. Each day was the same, and though the tasks changed with the seasons, the structure did not. Time was measured not in hours, but in duties, and those duties never ended. The relationship between medieval servants and their noble employers was defined by power, dependency, and strict hierarchy. It was not a partnership. It was an arrangement built on obligation and control, often enforced through custom fear, and the absence of legal recourse. Lords and ladies held near total authority over the people within their manorial estates. This authority was both economic and judicial. In England, the manorial court, usually presided over by the Lord Steward, handled disputes, issued punishments, and enforced obligations. For servants, this meant their employer was often also their judge. Infractions as minor as breaking tools, failing to complete tasks, or speaking out of turn could result in fines, extra labor, or corporal punishment. In the records of the Manor of Wakefield, dating back to the 14th century, laborers were routinely fined for lateness or poor workmanship. There was little room for protest. Expectations varied by household, but across Europe, discipline was harsh and surveillance constant. In noble estates, housemaids could be whipped for mishandling linen. Stable boys might be punished for a horse's injury, regardless of fault. And in some cases, young female servants were vulnerable to exploitation from men in power. A reality well documented in court petitions from both England and France. But legal protection for servants was minimal. Unless the incident disrupted property or honor, it often went unpunished. Yet not all noble households were defined purely by cruelty. In some cases, trusted servants, especially those in higher-ranking positions like stewards, butlers, or ladies' maids, could develop long-term roles within a household. The steward managed finances and oversaw other staff. A chamberlain might handle the lord's private affairs. These positions were still subordinate, but they offered limited upward mobility, sometimes even land or a pension upon retirement. In rare instances, a servant might rise to a post of administrative importance. In 13th century England, a man named William de la Pole, once a wool merchant's servant, rose to become a major financier to the crown, eventually ennobled. But such stories were uncommon. Rewards, when offered, were tied to loyalty and obedience. During feasts or religious festivals, lords might distribute leftover food, worn clothing, or pennies. A good harvest or successful hunt could mean a shared bonus, but only after the noble household's needs were met. Some servants were remembered in wills, receiving tools, clothing, or animals. Others spent decades in service and died with no more than they arrived with marriage. Among servants often required the lord's approval, especially when it involved serfs or villains. Unauthorized unions could be punished with fines. Children born on the estate were often expected to serve in the same household. For noble families, continuity of servitude ensured predictability. For the servant class, it guaranteed limitation. While romantic portrayals of chivalric loyalty dominate popular culture, real historical accounts show a different story. The division between servant and master was enforced daily, in speech, in dress, in gesture. Deference was mandatory. In some regions, servants could not sit in the lord's presence or speak unless spoken to. Even laughter in the wrong context could be grounds for rebuke. Power was not just exercised, it was displayed, and the servant's role at every level was to maintain the appearance of that power. Whether through silence, submission, or service, their labor reinforced the structure of nobility. And while a few found favor, most remained replaceable, a name scratched in a ledger, erased by time. The daily tools of a medieval servant were simple, often crude, and brutally effective. Iron knives, wooden buckets, whetstones, pitchforks, sickles, spades, and crude soap made from animal fat and ash. Each tool was essential to keeping the estate running, but none made the labor easier. There were no labor-saving devices, no gloves to protect the hands, and no boots built for comfort. The work was physical from sunrise to sundown and rarely paused for weather, illness, or injury. In the fields, the most common tools were the flail for threshing grain, the mat for breaking earth, and the heavy wooden plough drawn by oxen. These were not individual possessions. They belonged to the manor or to the lord and were distributed as needed. Tools wore out quickly, especially during harvest seasons, and replacement was not always prompt. Fieldwork meant constant bending, lifting, pulling, and walking long distances, usually barefoot or in thin leather shoes that wore down quickly. Back pain, knee degeneration, and chronic joint issues were widespread, though never recorded in detail. Medical attention, when available, came from herbalists or local clergy, neither trained in modern anatomy. Inside the manor, domestic servants used long-handled brooms, wooden paddles, iron pots weighing up to 30 pounds, and massive stone mortar for grinding. The scullery maid's job, alone, cleaning dishes, hauling water, scrubbing surfaces with sand or ashes, often involved hours of kneeling on stone floors. The laundry process was grueling. Clothes were beaten with paddles, boiled over, open, Fires scrubbed with harsh lye soap and wrung out by hand. Burns, and infections from cuts were common. Few servants lived past the age of 40, many didn't reach 30. The causes were cumulative: exhaustion, untreated wounds, respiratory issues from inhaling smoke and dust, and poor nutrition. Servants were expected to eat after the household had been fed. Their diet consisted largely of dark bread, a thin stew made from grains and vegetables, and sometimes small amounts of cheese or ale. Meat was rare and often stringy or spoiled. In lean seasons, food shortages could mean going hungry for days. Living quarters were cramped, dark, and cold. Servants slept in kitchens, attics, stables, or outbuildings. Straw bedding was infested with fleas. Ventilation was poor, especially in winter when windows were sealed to retain heat. Sanitation was rudimentary. Waste was disposed of in pits or thrown into nearby ditches. Water sources often shared with animals were easily contaminated. Hygiene was a concern but not well understood. Bathing occurred infrequently, and soap made from boiled animal fat and lye was harsh on skin. Shared wash basins, infrequent laundering, and constant physical contact made lice and skin infections widespread. Dental care was non-existent. Tooth loss by 30 was common, driven by a grain-heavy diet full of grit from millstones and poor oral hygiene. In this environment, illness spread fast. Typhoid, dysentery, and influenza moved through manners unchecked. Open wounds easily turned septic. Minor infections could turn fatal. And for many servants, time off to recover wasn't an option. If one collapsed, another was waiting to take their place in the structure of medieval servitude. Women were indispensable and disposable at the same time. They worked in kitchens, laundries, fields, and chambers, always present, rarely acknowledged. Their labor was constant, their recognition nearly non-existent. Unlike men, whose roles were often task-specific and public, female servants operated in the domestic shadows, burdened with expectations that reached far beyond physical labor. Young girls were often placed into service by their families before reaching adulthood. In wealthier households, they might work as chambermaids, nursemaids, or kitchen girls. In poorer manners, they scrubbed floors, prepared food, spun wool, or carried water. The tasks were repetitive, physically exhausting, and socially invisible. There were no protective laws, no legal contracts, and no guaranteed wages. Many worked only for food, shelter, and the faint hope of survival. Their vulnerability extended far beyond labor. Female servants had no legal recourse in the face of abuse, which was widespread and rarely punished. Court records from 14th century England, including those preserved in the York Asylum, contain scattered references to assaults on female servants, often dismissed unless the accused was of exceptionally low status or the victim had powerful connections. More often, the cases weren't recorded at all. If a pregnancy occurred as the result of exploitation, the consequences fell entirely on the woman. She could be dismissed without compensation, shamed publicly, or forced into marriage. Children born out of wedlock were labeled as illegitimate, and the mother bore the full social weight of that label. In manorial records, illegitimacy was often treated as a form of theft, the servant accused not just of dishonor, but of burdening the manor's resources. Childbirth itself was hazardous. Without trained midwives or medical knowledge, deliveries often took place on dirt floors, aided only by other women in the household. Complications were frequent. Infection, hemorrhage, and obstructed labor claimed countless lives. Records from parish registers in Norfolk and Kent show unusually high death rates among young servant women, particularly those under the age of 25. Most were buried without headstones, their names listed only in death rolls, if at all. Religious teachings reinforced their marginal status. Church sermons and manuals like De Secretis Mulierum painted women as morally weak, inherently sinful, and in need of constant supervision. A servant accused of theft, gossip, or even misfortune, such as a failed harvest or a sick child, could find herself blamed as a source of moral decay. In some regions, this scapegoating crossed into superstition. By the 15th century, accusations of witchcraft disproportionately targeted lower-class women, many of whom had served as domestic workers. Yet despite their precarity, female servants kept medieval society functioning. They raised children who weren't their own. They managed the household rhythms of the wealthy. They spun the wool that clothed Europe and baked the bread that fed entire states. But their stories rarely survive in letters or chronicles. Instead, they are found in fines, in burial fees, or in the margin notes of forgotten legal documents, quiet traces of women who worked, suffered, and vanished behind the walls of history for the medieval servant. Religion wasn't separate from daily life. It was the framework that defined it. The church, ever present and unquestioned, shaped how they understood their suffering, their place in society, and the consequences of defiance. It didn't just govern Sunday, it dictated the rhythm of every day, from the bells that marked prayer hours to the feast days that broke up the work calendar. Most servants were illiterate. They didn't read scripture themselves. Their understanding came through sermons, stained glass, and the spoken word of priests, men often aligned more with the local lord than with the people laboring beneath him. In countless villages across Europe, the message was consistent. Obedience was godly, and hardship was the price of eternal salvation. Resistance wasn't just rebellion against a master. It was sin. The rule of Saint Benedict, though written in the 6th century, remained influential throughout the Middle Ages. It praised humility, silence, and labor qualities, idealized not only in monastic life, but subtly imposed on the servant class. In many cases, bishops and clergy drew from Pauline texts, such as Ephesians 6-5 servants, be obedient to them that are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling. These verses were quoted from pulpits and echoed by landlords seeking order through divine justification. Suffering was often framed as redemptive. Illness, hunger, and early death were interpreted as trials of the soul, preparing the faithful for the afterlife. The Book of Job, a tale of unwavering faith amid suffering, was frequently cited as a model for Christian endurance. The implicit message, endure pain now to gain paradise later. Superstition filled the gaps that theology didn't explain. Servants were especially exposed to folk beliefs, omens, curses, protective charms, passed down orally within rural communities. A sudden illness might be blamed on a sin not confessed. A poor harvest could be punishment for moral failure. A miscarriage might be seen as divine judgment. These interpretations were reinforced by local clergy and rarely challenged, especially in remote manors far from city centers. Confession played a central role in controlling guilt and behavior. Servants were expected to confess not only personal sins, but also their thoughts. Envy of a lord's wealth, anger toward a fellow laborer, fatigue mistaken for laziness, Priests, often members of the same feudal hierarchy, acted as both spiritual guides and social enforcers. The church offered comfort, but it also preserved the hierarchy. Heaven was promised, but only through obedience. Justice was deferred to the afterlife. And the structure that kept lords in power was mirrored in every altar, every parable, and every kneeling prayer. Medieval servitude wasn't without resistance. Beneath the surface of obedience and routine, acts of defiance were constant, if rarely documented. Some were quiet, a tool hidden, a task left undone, a portion of bread taken from the kitchens. Others were louder, spilling into open revolt. When pressure pushed beyond what the human body or spirit could endure. In many manorial records, small-scale infractions appear as fines or punishments. A servant caught stealing a chicken, hiding wool, or failing to report for work could be brought before the manor court and sentenced to additional labor or public shame. In a 1297 entry from the manor of Halesowen, a female servant was fined for concealing eggs. It was theft. Technically, though it's more likely she was trying to feed herself or her siblings. Some resisted through slowdowns. Tasks were delayed without explanation. Livestock went untended. Fields were left half-plowed. These were difficult to trace directly, and lords often blamed poor harvests or divine wrath rather than acknowledge labor resistance. Servants had no unions, but they understood leverage. A sick ox could be feigned. A broken plow could take days to repair, all while protests simmered behind lowered eyes. Others fled. Escaping the manor was dangerous and illegal, but it happened. Runaway notices appear in court rolls and royal decrees. In 1350, Edward III issued orders for the capture of all villains and laborers who flee from their lords, contrary to law. Punishment ranged from fines to whipping, and repeat offenders could be imprisoned. But many tried anyway, especially during times of upheaval when the feudal structure began to wobble. That wobble became rupture in 1381. The peasants' revolt, sparked by harsh poll taxes and decades of post-plague exploitation, saw thousands of servants, farmhands, and artisans march from Kent and Essex to London. They demanded an end to serfdom, fair wages, and justice from the king himself. In the chaos, manor houses were attacked, tax collectors killed, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, was executed. At its height, the rebellion entered the capital. Servants joined not just out of politics, but out of lived exhaustion. They had borne the weight of noble comfort and seen little in return. The revolt was crushed quickly, its leaders, like Wat Tyler, killed or executed, but the message lingered. Lords began to fear the hands that fed them. Resistance didn't end with open revolt. It returned to the shadows, in the hidden loaf, the unreported hour, the silent refusal. Servants had few rights, but they still had boundaries. And when crossed, those boundaries didn't always break. Sometimes they pushed back. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in England. Within 2 years, it had killed as much as half the population. Entire villages were wiped out. Fields were abandoned. Churches stood silent. The death toll didn't distinguish between lord or servant, but the aftermath rewrote the rules, especially for those who had always lived under someone else's command. Before the plague, the social structure was rigid. Labor was plentiful. Wages were low. Movement was restricted. But once the mortality set in, the imbalance shifted. Lords faced an immediate crisis. Their fields couldn't be plowed. Livestock went untended. Estates once run by dozens were reduced to a few survivors. Suddenly, the laborer, once replaceable, became essential. Survivors among the servant class realized their value had changed. Many began to walk away, seeking better conditions elsewhere. A domestic worker in Suffolk could now be hired in Norfolk for twice the pay and half the work. Some demanded wages for what was once unpaid service. Others refused traditional obligations altogether. This wasn't charity, it was necessity. Without labor, manorial income collapsed. Landowners and the crown responded with panic. In 1351, King Edward III passed the Statute of Labourers, a sweeping attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prohibit labourers from moving freely. It criminalized both those who offered higher pay and those who accepted it. But enforcement was weak. The statute relied on a bureaucracy that had also been gutted by disease. Manorial records from this period reflect the change. In Winchester and East Anglia, servants began appearing as contracted labourers rather than hereditary villains. Some negotiated better food, better quarters, or a fixed term of employment. It didn't dismantle the system, but it introduced cracks. The idea of lifelong bondage began to erode. In some cases, former servants took over abandoned land. They became tenants or smallholders, roles previously out of reach. Parish records from the decades after 1350 show names that once appeared in labour rolls now listed as yeomen or free tenants. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a shift. The plague hadn't just killed bodies, it had disrupted expectations. The elite tried to reassert control, but the old order never fully returned. Across Europe, the labouring poor had glimpsed a version of life with choice, however limited. And though many were pulled back into familiar patterns, the knowledge remained under the right conditions. The powerless could renegotiate their place, even within a world built to keep them in place. Running water, electric lights, privacy, a change of clothes. These are considered basic in the modern world. But for the average medieval servant, none of it existed. Their world was built on physical labor, repetition, and submission, not for days or months, but for life. From the moment they could walk, their fate was shaped by forces beyond their control. Birth determined status, status determined access, and for most, there was no upward path, only survival. The tasks were constant, scrubbing floors with ash and sand, hauling water for hours, waking before the sun to prepare bread that they would never eat fresh themselves. Tools were few, comforts were fewer. Their bodies gave out long before old age arrived, and yet it wasn't just physical, it was mental. Servants lived in a world where obedience was more than expectation. It was virtue. They were taught that their suffering was righteous, their position divinely ordered. Questioning authority could mean punishment. Refusing it could mean starvation. Even their thoughts were not fully their own. The church dictated what was moral. The manor dictated what was acceptable. The law offered no refuge. Independence wasn't suppressed. It was unthinkable. A modern worker complains of long hours, but those hours end. A medieval servant's day ended only when the Lord's work was finished. There were no weekends, no time off, and no negotiation. In a noble household, even personal space was a luxury. Servants slept near fires they didn't light for themselves, in rooms they could be dismissed from without notice. Women faced constant risk of assault, of shame, of being dismissed, pregnant and penniless. Men bore injuries from field labor and stable work that went untreated. Every illness was a threat. Every accident could be fatal. But perhaps the hardest part wasn't the toil or the hunger. It was the invisibility. Most servants died without a trace. No gravestone, no family record, no memory passed down. Their names appear, if at all, in court fines, debt tallies, or burial rolls. Their stories were never told, because they were never meant to be told. They lived lives designed to support others. They were the reason castles stood clean, fields remained fertile, and nobles lived in comfort, yet their contribution remains buried beneath centuries of fulness. So, could you survive it? Not just the cold, the filth, the work, but the erasure, the loss of self, of agency, of identity. Could you endure knowing that nothing you do would be remembered, and that this was expected of you from birth? It wasn't just hard, it was total, and for millions across centuries, it was the only life they ever knew.